In August 1914, Europe plunged into a storm of war with a speed and magnitude that stunned the entire continent. Only weeks after the outbreak of the First World War, military plans that had been crafted over decades were suddenly put to the test under the harshest possible conditions. For the German Empire, the conflict was existential. Situated in the heart of Europe, Germany faced the threat of being crushed between two fronts, France in the west and Russia in the east. To avoid a drawn-out war of attrition, the German General Staff placed all its hopes in the Schlieffen Plan, a bold strategy designed to defeat France swiftly with a decisive blow delivered through neutral Belgium. Belgium, a small nation with immense strategic value, quickly became a victim of great power rivalry. Germany's violation of Belgian neutrality was not merely a military act. It was a political earthquake that shattered the European diplomatic order and brought Britain into the war. Yet for Berlin, every political risk was secondary to one overriding military imperative: speed. The German army needed to march fast, strike hard, and break through every obstacle on the road to Paris before the French and British could form a coherent defensive line. In this context, Belgium's network of fortresses became steel gates obstructing Germany's advance. After smashing the defenses of Liège with unprecedented heavy artillery fire, the Germans pushed toward another crucial objective: Namur. Situated at the junction of the Sambre and Meuse rivers, Namur was a key point controlling the main routes from central Belgium into northern France. Militarily, it was not merely a city, but a modern fortress system built at the end of the 19th century to block invading armies from the east. Namur's defenses, designed by the renowned military engineer Henri Alexis Brialmont, who also planned the forts of Liège, consisted of a ring of 9 concrete fortresses positioned 6 to 9 kilometers from the city center. Together, they formed an interlocking shield of artillery fire. Pre-war doctrine held that these forts could hold off a large enemy force for weeks, even months, buying precious time for Belgian field armies and their allies to counterattack. For Belgium, Namur carried significance both strategic and symbolic. The unexpectedly rapid fall of Liège had dealt a severe blow to national morale. Namur thus became the next symbol of resistance, a place where the Belgians hoped to prove that even a small nation could stand firm against Germany's colossal war machine. Belgian soldiers manning the forts felt both determination and dread, fully aware that the enemy they faced possessed firepower beyond anything imagined in peacetime. Meanwhile, the German High Command had already absorbed the lessons of Liège. The swift collapse of supposedly modern fortresses under heavy artillery fire reinforced their confidence in the decisive role of technology and firepower. Massive guns, most famously the 420mm Krupp Big Bertha and the Austro-Hungarian 305mm mortars, were viewed as weapons capable of pulverizing any fixed fortification. Namur, therefore, was not seen as an insurmountable barrier, but as an obstacle to be crushed quickly in order to maintain the momentum of the German right wing. Strategically, capturing Namur would widen the German advance toward the Sambre River and northern France, while securing the flank of the armies driving deeper into Belgium. If Namur held out too long, the rhythm of the Schlieffen Plan risked being disrupted, an outcome that could have dire consequences for the entire campaign in the West. Thus, in the war rooms of Berlin, Namur's fate had been sealed well before the first shells fell. The fortress had to be subdued in the shortest time possible. On the eve of the siege, tension hung heavily over the city. Namur's peaceful days along the Meuse came to an end as distant artillery booms signaled the arrival of war. Belgian soldiers inspected their guns, shelters, and ammunition stocks, while civilians either fled or hid, frightened by the thought of weapons they had never seen before. Across the lines, the Germans hauled their colossal siege guns into position, silent, looming engines of destruction awaiting the order to fire. All these elements converged to make Namur one of the most critical flashpoints of the war's opening phase. The upcoming siege would not simply test the durability of Belgian fortifications. It would stand as a brutal demonstration of how modern warfare had fundamentally changed, where concrete, steel, and human courage were forced to confront firepower that exceeded anything previously conceived. As the siege of Namur began in mid-August 1914, the two sides entered the battle with profoundly different forces, military doctrines, and levels of preparation. differences that starkly reflected the gap between a highly industrialized great power and a small nation fighting to defend its sovereignty. Namur was not a conventional field battle. It was a direct confrontation between fixed fortifications and modern industrial firepower, where every choice in command, weaponry, and organization carried life or death consequences. On the Belgian side, the defense of Namur fell to the fortress garrison, part of Belgium's regular army. The regional commander, Lieutenant General Augustin Michel, was an experienced officer but faced severe constraints in manpower and equipment. The Namur garrison totaled just over 30,000 troops before the siege. Infantry assigned to the forts, artillery crews, and engineer units. These forces were distributed among the 9 forts encircling the city, along with intermediary defense positions meant to cover the gaps between them. Namur's fortification system, designed by the prominent military engineer Henri Alexis Brialmont, reflected late 19th century defensive principles. The forts were constructed of unreinforced concrete and equipped with rotating guns housed in armored turrets, intended to withstand ordinary field artillery. Their armament consisted mainly of medium and small caliber guns, machine guns, and short-range defensive weapons arranged to form interlocking fields of fire. In theory, the forts could support one another and form a continuous defensive ring capable of delaying a major invasion force for an extended period. However, the Belgian preparations revealed serious weaknesses from the outset. Brialmont's forts were designed in an era before artillery technology reached the devastating levels of 1914. Their unreinforced concrete, poor ventilation, and living quarters placed deep inside the forts, but not protected against heavy siege shells, became fatal liabilities. Moreover, Belgian artillery at Namur had significantly shorter range and smaller calibers than the German siege guns, leaving them almost incapable of effective counter-battery fire. Morale among Belgian troops was a fragile balance of determination and fear. The fall of Liège, once believed impregnable, had shaken confidence deeply. Reports that Liège's modern forts had been destroyed in just a few days weighed heavily on the defenders. Even so, their duty gave them no alternative. They remained at their posts, waiting inside the concrete walls for the storm of fire that everyone knew was coming. On the opposing side, the German army deployed a well-organized siege force, shaped directly by the lessons of Liège. Command of the Namur operation was entrusted to General Max von Gallwitz, an artillery officer acutely aware of the decisive power of heavy fire in modern war. Under his authority stood infantry, engineers, and, most importantly, an unprecedented concentration of heavy siege artillery, the likes of which Europe had never seen in the field. The German force numbered tens of thousands of troops, yet its true strength lay not in its infantry, but in its colossal artillery. The Germans brought forward the mighty 420mm Krupp howitzers, better known as Big Berthas, along with Austro-Hungarian 305mm mortars. These guns could fire shells weighing hundreds of kilograms, capable of smashing through meters of concrete, something Belgian forts had never been designed to resist. German preparations were meticulous and deliberate. Siege gun positions were chosen with great care, usually beyond the reach of Belgian defensive fire. German engineers constructed firing platforms, supply routes, and camouflage systems to conceal the massive guns from observation. Infantry units stood ready to exploit breaches in the defenses the moment the artillery opened the way. Doctrinally, the Germans did not view the siege of Namur as a prolonged battle of attrition. Their objective was swift destruction of the fort system through overwhelming firepower, forcing the defenders to surrender or flee before German infantry had to risk significant losses. It was an approach that fused industrial warfare with insights from traditional siegecraft, elevated to an entirely new level by modern artillery technology. The contrast between the two sides was unmistakable even before the first shots were fired. On one side stood a static defensive force, relying on concrete, steel, and the belief that their forts could hold long enough for relief to arrive. On the other was a modern siege machine, confident in the power of its guns and the speed of execution. Belgian soldiers braced for a long, suffocating siege within cramped fort interiors. German troops, though safely beyond Belgian range, sensed they were preparing to unleash a weapon that would permanently redefine the nature of warfare and fix defenses. When all preparations were complete, the massive German guns were loaded. Belgium's silent turrets waited in tense anticipation, and the city of Namur held its breath before the storm. What was about to unfold would be more than a test of courage. It would be a collision between two military eras, with the outcome nearly predetermined long before the first shell left its barrel. The siege of Namur formally entered its combat phase on August 20th, 1914, as the German war machine completed its deployment around the fortress complex. Unlike the field battles unfolding at the French-Belgian frontier, Namur began under an oppressive, menacing silence. The city, situated at the confluence of the Meuse and Sambre rivers, was nearly isolated as roads and railway lines fell one by one under German control. Inside the forts, Belgian soldiers waited in tense anticipation, fully aware that they were about to face a level of firepower never before tested on such a scale. In the opening days, the Germans did not immediately unleash the full might of their artillery. Under the command of General Max von Gallwitz, the operation unfolded with deliberate but steady precision. Reconnaissance and engineer units advanced to the outer perimeter of the fortress ring, mapping out each fort's location, structure, and firing angles. German infantry established encircling lines, cutting communications between Namur and Belgian forces outside the city, while preventing any attempt at reinforcement or counterattack from the south and west. On the Belgian side, Lieutenant General Augustin Michel tried to mount a defense according to classical fortress doctrine. Artillery crews were ordered to remain relatively silent, to avoid revealing firing positions and conserve ammunition for decisive moments. Namur's forts, with their steel-armored turrets rising above the surrounding hills, still projected an illusion of strength. Yet behind the concrete walls, anxiety grew, fueled by reports from Liège describing how modern forts had collapsed with shocking speed under German siege artillery. On August 21st, the first German shells began to fall. But these were not the heaviest guns. Medium-range artillery and field pieces were used to probe defenses, test Belgian responses, and force the forts to reveal firing positions. Some Belgian turrets fired back, but their limited range and accuracy proved inadequate. These retaliatory shots, though spirited, caused little to no damage to the Germans positioned beyond the effective reach of Belgian guns. For Belgian soldiers inside the forts, the opening phase became a prolonged ordeal of tension. They fought and lived in cramped, hot, poorly lit spaces, surrounded by the metallic clatter of turret machinery and the ceaseless reverberation of impacts. Every shot they fired risked exposing their exact position to German spotters. Even before the true bombardment began, psychological pressure had already begun to erode their morale. Meanwhile, the Germans completed the deployment of their heavy siege artillery. The massive 420mm Krupp howitzers and 305mm Austro-Hungarian mortars were pulled into firing positions under the cover of darkness, shielded by engineers and infantry. Transporting these colossal weapons was itself a logistical operation. Temporary rail tracks, cranes, and hundreds of soldiers worked in coordinated effort. Everything focused on placing the instruments of destruction exactly where they needed to be, out of Belgian range. By August 22nd, the situation changed dramatically. German artillery increased its rate of fire, shifting from probing to systematic suppression. The eastern and southeastern forts of Namur became primary targets. Shells landed in growing numbers, shaking the ground and causing the concrete structures to tremble. The first cracks appeared. Machinery inside the forts malfunctioned, and the already inadequate ventilation system struggled under the buildup of fumes and dust. Belgian guns tried to maintain a reply, but the imbalance grew more stark by the hour. Each German shell not only inflicted physical destruction, but delivered enormous psychological shock. Inside the forts, smoke, dust, and explosive gases accumulated, making breathing difficult. Many soldiers fought in a dazed, exhausted state, disoriented by noise, heat, and darkness, yet still committed to holding their positions as ordered. Outside the forts, German infantry continued to play a secondary role. They dug entrenchments, protected artillery positions, and waited for the moment when the fortress ring would crack open. There were no massive infantry assaults or large-scale firefights in these early days. The operation was designed so that the artillery would bear the weight of the battle. For the German soldier, this phase was one of tense observation, watching their own guns slowly suffocate the defenders. Thus, the opening phase of the siege unfolded as a one-sided but suffocating struggle. There were no dramatic infantry clashes, only the uneven contest between 19th century concrete and 20th century industrial artillery. With each passing day, the balance tipped further toward the Germans, not through rapid advance, but through the steady destruction of Belgian confidence in the fort's ability to endure. By the end of this initial stage, Belgian commanders could no longer ignore the signs. Namur was facing the same fate as Liège, but with even less hope. The forts had not yet fallen, but their structural and psychological weaknesses were increasingly evident. German fire was becoming more accurate, defensive systems were failing, and the forts could no longer guarantee the safety of the men inside them. Meanwhile, the Germans had completed all preparations for what would come next. A phase in which their artillery would be unleashed at full intensity, turning the siege from relentless pressure into a true storm of annihilation. The climax of the Siege of Namur erupted on August 23, 1914, when the German High Command decided to unleash the full destructive power of its siege artillery upon a fortress system that was already beginning to crack. What unfolded in this phase was no longer a siege in the traditional sense, but a cold and merciless demonstration of modern industrial warfare, where the fate of fortifications and the men inside them was determined hour by hour. At first light, the massive 420mm Krupp howitzers and the Austro-Hungarian 305mm mortars opened fire with unprecedented intensity. Each shell, hundreds of kilograms of steel and explosives, shrieked through the air before crashing down upon the forts like the hammer blows of a brutal god. The ground shook violently. Vast slabs of concrete split open, and steel turrets were wrenched from their bearings or jammed permanently in useless positions. Before the eyes of the Belgian garrisons, fortresses once seen as symbols of national resilience began to disintegrate piece by piece. The eastern and southeastern forts, already battered during the opening phase, became the focal points of the steel storm. Marchauvelet, Mézeray, Andoy, and Cognalet were struck by volleys of astonishing accuracy. The unreinforced concrete, designed only to resist 19th century field artillery, proved utterly helpless before the penetrating force of modern siege shells. Living quarters, ammunition stores, and ventilation systems were torn apart, turning the interior of the forts into choking hells of smoke, dust, and poisonous fumes. For the Belgian soldiers, the climax of the battle pushed human endurance beyond its limits. They were trapped in chambers that shook violently with each impact, plunged into darkness as lights failed, struggling to breathe in the thickened air while explosions pounded their bodies like physical blows. Many casualties resulted not from shell fragments, but from collapsing concrete, falling machinery, and the sheer pressure of the blasts. Cries for help echoed in the dark, only to be drowned out almost immediately by the next earth-shaking detonation. Under such conditions, the defenders' ability to fight collapsed with alarming speed. Turrets were disabled, communication lines between the forts and headquarters were cut, and coordinated fire became impossible. Lieutenant General Augustin Michel and his staff were forced to make decisions on fragmentary information, often hours out of date. Each fort now fought as an isolated island, deprived of support and rapidly losing coherence. Meanwhile, the Germans saw their carefully prepared strategy producing unmistakable results. The siege artillery, firing under precise direction, constantly adjusted its aim to concentrate on one target at a time until it was rendered completely ineffective. There was no haste, no reckless infantry assaults. German infantry remained outside the fort's range, calmly watching each defensive structure being pulverized before moving in to occupy the silent ruins. The climax of the siege was defined not only by the physical collapse of the forts, but by the mental collapse of the defenders. As the first forts went silent, the news spread rapidly through what remained of the communication network, triggering a wave of despair. Any lingering belief that Namur could withstand a long siege vanished. Those still capable of fighting now faced the grim reality that they were up against an enemy for whom traditional fortifications held no meaning. August 24th marked the peak of destruction. German artillery increased its pace once more, reducing the remaining forts in systematic order. Structures that had taken years to build were smashed apart within hours. German infantry finally advanced into the shattered works, capturing exhausted, disoriented Belgian survivors. Many barely able to stand after the ordeal. Within the city of Namur, civilians experienced the terror indirectly, but no less intensely. The explosions shook entire neighborhoods. Smoke columns rose over the horizon, flashes lit the night sky, and the unending roar of artillery made the city feel trapped within a nightmare from which there was no escape. The violent climax of the siege of Namur demonstrated the absolute gulf between two military eras. On one side stood forts built on the 19th century belief that concrete and steel could resist any enemy. On the other stood modern industrial artillery, engineered with the sole purpose of obliterating fixed defenses. In such a confrontation, Belgian courage, however admirable, could not compensate for obsolete fortifications. As the climax passed, Namur no longer resembled a fortress at all, but a landscape of ruins, dust, and shattered men. Its defensive system had been broken militarily, psychologically, and organizationally. What remained was only a matter of time before the inevitable end. The climax of the siege of Namur thus marked not only the height of destructive firepower, but the historical moment in which an entire era of fortress warfare gave way to the crushing force of modern industrial conflict. By August 25, 1914, the siege of Namur had officially come to an end amid ruins, smoke, and a suffocating silence that hung over what had once been considered one of the strongest defensive systems in Europe. After days of enduring unprecedented levels of siege artillery fire, the remaining forts of Namur fell silent one by one. These concrete structures, designed to withstand any foreseeable attack, were not defeated by time or a lack of courage, but by destructive power far beyond anything military planners of the late 19th century could have imagined. Militarily, the fall of Namur was a swift and near-total victory for the German Empire. Under the command of General Max von Gallwitz, the Germans achieved their strategic objective in remarkably short order, exactly as demanded by the strict timetable of the Schlieffen Plan. With Namur's defenses shattered, the German right wing gained an open corridor along the Sambre and Meuse rivers, securing its flank as it drove deeper into France. No Belgian counteroffensive was strong enough to alter the outcome, and all hopes of delaying the enemy for an extended period evaporated completely. For Belgium, Lieutenant General Augustin Michel was forced to accept that continued resistance within destroyed or crippled forts would amount only to needless sacrifice. Some garrison units withdrew when possible. Others were captured after their forts were overrun. Though no formal dramatic act of surrender occurred, Namur had, in every practical sense, been subdued. The city fell into German hands, marking the collapse of one of Belgium's final major defensive anchors in the country's center. The casualties of the siege starkly reflected the one-sided nature of modern siege warfare. Belgian forces suffered heavily, with thousands killed, wounded, or captured during the bombardments and the fall of the forts. Many casualties came not from direct combat, but from collapsing structures, flying concrete fragments, explosive fumes, and the brutal survival conditions inside shattered fortifications. Those who survived emerged from the rubble exhausted, disoriented, and carrying indelible memories of the overwhelming power of modern artillery. German forces also suffered losses, but at a much lower scale. Most of their casualties occurred during the encirclement, reconnaissance, and occupation of destroyed forts, not from large-scale assaults. The victory at Namur stood as a clear demonstration of the effectiveness of heavy siege artillery as the decisive tool for breaking fixed defenses while minimizing infantry casualties. From a purely military standpoint, it was a meticulously executed and highly efficient campaign. Yet the impact of Namur extended far beyond a tactical success. For Belgium, the rapid fall of the forts, coming so soon after the shock of Liège, struck a devastating blow to the belief that a small nation could rely on fixed fortifications to hold off an industrial great power. Although Belgian forces continued fighting in the months that followed, Namur signaled the complete dissolution of their central defensive line and forced them into a more mobile, flexible form of warfare under extremely unfavorable conditions. For Belgium's allies, particularly France and Britain, Namur served as a severe warning. It demonstrated that even the most elaborate and expensive modern forts could not withstand the firepower of large-caliber siege guns. Strategic assumptions built around static defense began to unravel. Military staffs across Europe were compelled to recognize that warfare had entered a new era, one in which industrial firepower could erase in days what had been designed to endure for months. For Germany, the victory reinforced confidence in the Schlieffen Plan and the supremacy of heavy artillery. The rapid collapse of Belgium's two major fortress systems, Liège and Namur, created the impression that no fixed obstacle could significantly slow the German advance. This contributed to an atmosphere of optimism, even overconfidence within the German command as they pushed further into France. Though events later would reveal that the war would not end nearly as quickly as the fall of Namur seemed to promise. In the broader history of warfare, the 1914 siege of Namur is regarded as a defining moment marking the end of the 19th century fortress era. The Brialmont forts, once celebrated as the pinnacle of defensive engineering, were overcome within days by the sheer destructive capacity of modern industrial artillery. From this point onward, all belligerents were forced to rethink military doctrine, shifting from fixed fortifications to trenches, defense in depth, and flexible combined arms operations. In retrospect, the fall of Namur is not merely the story of a captured city or shattered forts. It is the tragedy of soldiers caught between outdated beliefs and a new, unforgiving reality. Men defending structures built for a kind of war that no longer existed. Amid the ruins surrounding Namur, modern warfare asserted its brutal authority, leaving Europe with a bitter lesson. In an age of steel, explosives, and industry, no wall, no matter how thick, can shield humanity from the sweeping destruction of total war. The 1914 siege of Namur ended in fire and ruins, yet its echoes resonated deeply throughout the history of the First World War. In just a few short days, the forts once regarded as symbols of national defensive strength were shattered by the firepower of modern industry, exposing the fragility of human resistance before a war machine operating with unprecedented speed and destructive force. Namur did not simply fall. It marked the end of an era of fixed fortifications and ushered in the age of total war, where steel and explosives would determine the fate of entire cities. How do you feel about the siege of Namur and the brutal disparity between the old fortress system and modern siege artillery? What haunts you more? The rapid collapse of structures once deemed impregnable, or the fate of the Belgian soldiers forced to fight inside fort walls as they crumbled around them? If you found this story meaningful and rich in historical depth, please consider liking the video, subscribing, and following the channel as we continue exploring the fierce battles that shaped the First World War and the modern world.